there's been a fair amount of news coming out of Ukraine, and one of the interesting things which I always keep my ear out is signs of America talking about WMDs, because this always ends well historically.
Oh, yes.
But let's just remind ourselves of the situation in the West at the start of this conflict. What did Joe Biden do when he got into power in 2021? He signed a record number of executive orders. He blocked fracking exploration, he banned the Keystone XL pipeline from Canada to the US, and he printed an absolute ton of cash. If you look at this graph here, you can see from Trading Economics that as soon as he gets into power in 2021, what happens to the inflation rate? Straight up. It's nearly at 8% now.
Ouch.
A historic high. That basically means essentially an 8% annual tax on all of your cash savings. It's enormous. And very depressing, personally. But there we go. So he's printing money like it's going out of fashion, and it might well be. The abolition of cash in favour of central bank digital currencies, as we covered last week, would appear to be a major part of the World Economic Forum agenda and threatens to establish an iron grip of governments over their people for many years to come.
Oh dear.
Long before the Ukraine crisis started, there were concerns that the US economy would struggle to recover from the money-printing financial regime, with some commentators speculating that the Federal Reserve might slam on the brakes to the money printer and bring much of the economy screeching to a halt. Boris Johnson, Justin Trudeau and Emmanuel Macron have emerged from the COVID crisis carrying a great deal of popular animosity for their repressive treatment of the people. I mean, there have been protests in all of these countries, right?
Oh, yes.
And more. So in France, you have the Gilets jaunes, the COVID protests, and so on. In Canada, you have the truckers' protest, of course, immediately before the invasion of Ukraine. And in the UK as well, there's a lot of animosity towards Boris Johnson's completely unconservative government.
Yes.
As a result, they're all rather unpopular with voters. But fortunately for them, the Galtieri effect is at play. Conflict abroad distracts from troubles at home.
Of course.
And that's all anyone is talking about at the moment, really, is Ukraine. COVID has gone by the wayside. The shutting down of the economy for 2 years seems to have taken a backseat.
It's like it never happened.
Exactly. As a weapon of mass distraction, the conflict in Ukraine has been a godsend for Western leaders. But will they respond to the crisis appropriately, with the firm and measured actions of national statesmen? What do you think?
To be honest, I'm quite concerned.
Yeah, I don't think they will.
No.
Personally. As we've covered previously, cancelling people is seemingly the only thing that the Twitter-addled political class seems capable of doing. It's quite remarkable how effective discriminatory denial of service can be, whether you're unpersoning lone dissidents, shutting down alternative tech platforms, or even cutting the world's largest country by land area out of the global economy. But in order for sanctions to be effective, they have to be universal.
Yeah.
Sanctions do not simply mean we will boycott you. They mean we will smite any company on the face of the earth that even thinks of trading with you.
Yes, and currently Russia is experiencing probably the biggest cancelling of that kind in human history.
Yes. As a result, the US has recently issued warnings to Chinese companies against trading with Russia. And we have this article here. Chinese companies that aid Russia could face US repercussions, Commerce Secretary warns. Wonder if she's another diversity hire.
Yes.
Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, said the US could take devastating action against Chinese companies that defy Russian sanctions. Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, issued a stern warning Tuesday to Chinese companies that might defy US restrictions against exporting to Russia, saying the United States would cut them off from American equipment and software they need to make their products. The Biden administration could essentially shut down Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation or any Chinese companies that defy US sanctions by continuing to supply chips and other advanced technology to Russia, Ms. Raimondo said in an interview with the New York Times. Are we getting Napoleonic continental system vibes here by any chance?
Yes, I was actually going to say, I think this is very much falling into that picture.
So for those who aren't aware, the continental system, when Napoleon essentially won the Napoleonic Wars on the continent, he was still at war with Britain. And so in order to essentially cancel Britain or sanction Britain, he forbade any of his client states and vassals in Europe, the whole of Europe, from trading with Britain to try and choke out Britain's economy. And it completely failed and essentially resulted in him invading Russia, getting his backside handed to him on a plate, and his ultimate downfall. They continue. The United States, the European Union, and other governments have issued sweeping sanctions and export controls in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The export controls prohibit the sale of certain high-tech products, including advanced semiconductors, to Russia and Belarus. The US export controls apply not just to American companies, but to companies anywhere in the world that use American software or technology to manufacture their products, which includes many Chinese companies.
This would hurt China quite a lot, wouldn't it?
It would, yes. It would. Now, people do think that that people who haven't studied China much get the impression that China's economy is massive and invincible, but I think it is vulnerable and fragile in many respects.
Yeah. We, in effect, have the button to their downfall because of how dependent they are on imports.
Yes, but the argument is that we are so dependent on their imports as well.
Yes.
So who would it really hurt more?
Fair
Now, I'm
question.
generally in favour of being strict on Chinese companies operating in the West, and I personally believe we should have woken up to the problem of Chinese intellectual property theft and predatory outsourcing practices 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But is now really the time?
Probably not.
Like, we've already seen the scale of disruption caused to people's lives by the cancellation of Russia. We've had metal prices skyrocketing, energy prices through the roof, cost of living going through the roof as well, and this is all being borne by the ordinary consumer. Russia's economy is minuscule compared to China's. Is the Biden administration really prepared to start an economic war on two fronts?
It would be an act of insanity, but it would nonetheless be the action of a dying world order. And that's what worries me.
Well, the thing which concerns me is, yes, forget all of this hyperbole about World War III, but we may be seeing a kind of economic world war playing out before our eyes.
Yes.
The autocratic regimes of Russia, China, and much of the non-Western world can clearly see the problems with American global hegemony. The infiltration of their societies by Californian social media corporations.
Yep.
These big tech empires that see themselves as holding the God-given right to, for example, indoctrinate children into LGBT ideology, to manipulate public discourse in foreign countries and sway national elections, to foment unrest and even facilitate revolutions.
Let's not forget how much they pander to the Chinese market as well. So there's indirect coercion there as well. Activision Blizzard.
But make no mistake, the Saudis, for example, Saudi Arabia, knows that Washington would wipe them off the face of the earth in an instant if it were politically feasible. Right? The Saudi regime is, in many ways, morally anathema to the diversity, inclusion, and equity regimes of the West. And the Americans have been broadcasting this exceptionalist, totalizing ideology for a long time. They have decided what is right. They have defined the direction of human progress, and any nation, culture, or creed that stands against it will be swept away.
Yes.
That's the impression that
international
these
law
regimes
is their
are saying.
system of ethics, in effect.
Yes,
isn't it? And
it
that's why China's acting in such open contempt of it on the intellectual property front, because it just doesn't recognise it as a universal system of ethics at all.
Absolutely. And then in the recent January joint declaration between Beijing and Moscow, one of the things which they identified was this totalizing, moralizing force coming out of the West. And they said, well, that should just be your international order, and people who want a different, countries that want a different international order should be able to have one.
And when we were willing to come to the table, you basically said no, in the case of Putin, anyway.
Yeah. They also see the immense technological advantage that the West possesses as transformative, transhumanist technologies are appearing on the horizon. They see the strength and sophistication of NATO and the unrivaled power projection capability of the US military. But they also see the weaknesses of the West. They see atomized societies, weak ideas, paralyzing culture wars, anti-meritocratic ideologies of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Maybe, just maybe, they can see the writing on the wall. They can see what's happening to Russia's economy now happening to them in the future. And if that's the case, then we could be seeing a rather interesting geopolitics from here on out.
Oh, yes.
Much of this has been discussed in terms of a move away from the dollar and towards either a gold-backed currency or the replacement with the Chinese renminbi as the currency underpinning an international financial system outside the orbit of the USA. And let's not forget, this is very important because in order to set up an alternative international set of rules, you need an alternative international financial system to ground it in, as they report here in the Financial Times. China, Russia, and the race to a post-dollar world. Financial markets are going to become a major field of battle, a place to defend liberal values and renew old alliances. Consider China's long-term goal of building a post-dollarized world in which Russia would be one of many vassal states settling all transactions in renminbi. Getting there is not an easy process. The Chinese want to de-dollarize, but they also want complete control of their own financial system. That's a difficult circle to square. One of the reasons that the dollar is the world's reserve currency is that, in contrast, the US markets are very open and very liquid, whereas the Chinese market is quite closed and controlled. Still, the Chinese hope to use trade and petropolitics of the moment to increase the renminbi's share of global foreign exchange. One high-level Western investor in China told me he expected that share would rise from 2% to as high as 7% in the next 3 to 4 years. But that is, of course, still minuscule compared with the position of the dollar, which is 59%. But the Chinese are playing a long game. Finance is a key pillar in the new great power competition with America. Currency, capital flows, and the Belt and Road Initiative trade pathway will all play a role in that. Beijing is slowly diversifying its foreign exchange reserves as well as buying up a lot of gold. This can be seen as a kind of hedge on a post-dollar world, the assumption being that gold will rise as the dollar falls. So the West is relatively weak at the moment. Its leaders are Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, for goodness sake.
Yes.
If the anti-democratic forces were to combine to challenge the international economic system that America has written and ruled over for many years, could they secure a future for themselves outside the American hegemony, set up their own trading bloc with its own rules and its own technologies?
Well, that's in effect what they're doing with Africa, isn't it? In China.
They are certainly creating a lot of influence in Africa and in Latin America as well, I believe.
But aren't they actually giving them loans to start up coal mines whilst closing down their own?
I believe so, but there's a lot involved in it because it's the same kind of, you could call it hybrid warfare that's waged by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund.
Quite.
It's just a different set of standards in a way, and in many ways harsher and worse for the people taking them over. But of course the IMF has been operating for a long time and has a rather poisonous reputation. I mean, look at its role in Greece or even in Ukraine, and you can see why a lot of third world leaders would be suspicious.
Well, it has a frontline role in the very pretext that led to the Ukraine invasion.
Yes.
I mean, it quite literally bankrolled, what was it, or at least gave a considerable help to Boris Yeltsin's campaign, who was, of course, the which was the point where I suppose Putin kind of smelt.
Well, that was, so you're talking about the early 90s here, so just after
1996,
just after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and you've got Yeltsin essentially stripping the remainder of the Soviet economy bare for his mates and the oligarchs, and the IMF bankrolling that. But it's with this narrative in mind that I see the White House and the State Department simultaneously releasing statements concerning alleged chemical weapons false flag attacks being planned by Russia in Ukraine. US officials say they are concerned Russia could potentially be preparing to use chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine after the Russian Defense Ministry accused Ukraine of possibly planning a false flag chemical weapon attack. An administration official told NBC News the US is worried that the Russians are making this claim against Ukraine to justify a false flag operation on them using chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine themselves. Does this sound familiar? It's like a stuck record at this point.
It's very, very familiar, but I don't want to comment on it because whatever I say, my take is almost certainly going to be the opposite of what turns out to be true.
We do believe that we should be on the lookout for Russia to possibly use chemical or biological weapons, the official said. The US is also concerned that Russia could be making the claim about Ukraine to justify its continued invasion of Ukraine. Now, many of our viewers should be aware that when the US starts talking about weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, like chemical weapons, it always ends well.
Yes.
So the two major examples I can think of are the Iraq WMDs, of course, which were, as far as I'm aware, completely fabricated.
Yes.
So they made up the story that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, invaded the country, overthrew the regime, and then just sort of quietly said, oh, yeah, there weren't any WMDs, of course not. What are you on about? Anyway, regime change, that's all well and good, right?
You'd think that would be a war crime, wouldn't you?
Yes. You think so? Well, it's one of the reasons why these dictatorial regimes, autocratic regimes like Russia and China, are very sort of dismissive of Western concerns in this invasion.
Yeah.
Because they point out that, well, when you want to invade people, you just
As
do
they
it.
see it, it's a structure of power that's designed to uphold the prevailing hegemony, if I'm to use critical theory's language.
Absolutely. And another case, which is somewhat more controversial, are the alleged Syria chemical weapons attacks. Now, it seems to be adopted as a truth by the mainstream media that there were 17 chemical weapons attacks by Assad's regime against rebels in Syria. But I think that's a rather murky allegation. I remember at the time there was a lot of doubt over whether it had actually happened, and it seemed to be quite a transparent attempt to manufacture a casus belli.
So it was never proved, was it?
Not to my satisfaction. No. I may be wrong, but let us know in the comments if that's so. So finally, I just want to conclude by saying what we are seeing taking place in Ukraine may just be the start of a titanic struggle over world hegemony, waged between the USA and its allies and those foreign states that stand against the moralizing globalist agenda of the World Economic Forum.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as the history series that Bo and Carl do together, this one on the French Revolution, starting off at part 0 with the life of Napoleon. And if you want to follow Carl, you can follow him on Getter at @CarlBenjamin. Thank you and goodbye.